My next videos are about graphing and solving simple inequalities. I'll first start out by talking about the number line and making sure that we realize that the further left our number is, the smaller the value is. I also want to remind you of what an inequality is. An inequality includes one of the four symbols here: a less than sign, a greater than sign, a less than or equal to sign, or a greater than or equal to sign. When we graph an inequality, we're going to always make sure that our variable's on the left at the very end. That way it'll be easier to graph. Also, when we graph, we'll use a closed dot, meaning that the point is included. We'll use a closed dot on the less than or equal to or greater than or equal to signs. And we'll use an open dot on the less than or greater than signs, meaning that the point is not included. We'll shade in the appropriate direction, and we'll do that by just following the arrow as long as the variable's on the left-hand side. The biggest rule in solving inequalities is that when we divide or multiply by a negative, we have to remember to flip that sign. We'll see all those rules in these examples I'm about to do. In the first example, I have a is less than -1. Now, notice how the variable's on the left-hand side. That's the way we want it to be. All I really need to do is make sure that I have -1 on my number line. I will include some other numbers as well, but -1 must be there. I'm going to use an open dot on -1, meaning that -1 is not included in part of my solution. And I'm going to shade to the left because that's the way the arrow is pointing. Notice if I was to put an arrow here, that's the way it's pointing. It's pointing to the left. So that is all it takes to graph an inequality. Sometimes we're also going to need to solve the inequality first. So in this one, since n is not by itself, I will be dividing by 3 because the opposite of multiplying will be dividing by 3. Now, in order to the rule about flipping the sign, you have to divide or multiply by a negative on both sides. I'm dividing by a +3, so I will not be flipping the sign. My answer is negative, but I'm not dividing by a negative number on both sides. I'm dividing by a +3 on both sides. I do want to go ahead and graph this inequality as well. I'm going to make sure to include -3 on my number line. I'll also include a few other points. In this case, I have a greater than or equal to sign. I will color in the dot, meaning -3 is part of my solution, and I will shade to the right because that's the way the arrow is pointing. So I'll go ahead and pretend that I'm making this an arrow so you guys can see that it is being shaded in the direction the arrow is pointing. My next example, the P is already by itself. However, the P is not on the left-hand side like the way I need it to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to flip-flop those around. Now, if I flip-flop the P and the 2 around, that means I also have to flip-flop around the sign. So notice how the arrow was pointing at the P. The arrow is still pointing at the P, so I've not changed the problem. This says P is less than 2. I will graph this inequality and I'll make sure that I include 2 on my number line as well as a few other points. And I'll use an open dot and I will shade to the left. That's which way the arrow is pointing now. On this example, W is by itself again, but I need to do a little simplifying on the left-hand side. So 2 squared is 2 times 2 minus 4 greater than or equal to W is what it says right now. 4 minus 4 is 0. W is not on the left-hand side, so I will flip-flop those around. When I flip-flop around my number and my letter, I also have to flip-flop the sign. I'll include 0 on my graph, 1 and -1. Colored in dot, because it's greater or less than or equal to, and I will shade to the left.